Ms. Pierschbacher, if you want to pull that screen up in front of you just a little bit, because that's where the exhibits will display for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Can you see the attorney? Yeah,
I can.
Okay. And you can adjust that so that
Okay.
it's not blocking you entirely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and I'll swear you in.
Okay.
All right, you've been called as a witness. If you'd raise your hand, you've been called as a witness. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be true and correct?
Yes.
All right, Ms. Nichols-Cook, whenever you're ready, and just for your benefit, when you identify an exhibit, it will be displayed on my screen and the witness's screen initially. Once it's been admitted, then we can put it up on the big screen, assuming I initiate contact with all the right buttons. All right.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Ms. Pierschbacher, could you state your name for the record today and spell it for the court reporter?
Yes, my name is Kari Pierschbacher, K-A-R-I-P-I-E-R-S-C-H-B-A-C-H-E-R.
Thank you. We appreciate you being here today. Can you tell the court how you are employed?
I'm employed by Edgewood-Colesburg School District in Edgewood, Iowa as a music teacher. I'm currently the 512 band director is my current position.
And do you also volunteer in your community?
Yes, I do. I'm a volunteer fireman, an EMT in Greeley, and an EMT in Edgewood.
And Greeley and Edgewood would both be towns or their own municipalities?
Yes, they are two separate towns here in Delaware County. They're closely located together, and I work in Edgewood, so we kind of run with both services, and both services do work closely together, so a lot of our calls are shared. If one gets called, a lot of times the other one will as well. Not always, but often.
And both Greeley and Edgewood, are they entirely volunteer
Yes.
organizations? Okay. And does Greeley run at the EMT level or at a different level?
We run at an EMT level. That means that we're guaranteed to have at least one EMT on the rig when the ambulance leaves and arrives at a patient.
What can an EMT do?
An EMT does basic life-saving support. We can do CPR, we can splint, we can do basic life-saving care. We cannot do anything invasive, such as in IV, and we cannot administer any drugs through IV or through injection. We can give basic drugs such as oxygen, aspirin, Narcan for a suspected drug overdose, and we can give albuterol for a breathing difficulty or an asthma attack.
Okay.
And those are the 4 drugs that we carry in Greeley that we are allowed to give.
What's the next higher level of care?
After EMT, then you would get to the paramedic level, and they can do those extra things. They can start IVs, they can administer drugs, and that would be the next level up. Edgewood runs at a paramedic level, and then I believe Manchester is a paramedic level, and then Colesburg and Earlville, I believe, are provisional Ps, which means that they sometimes have a paramedic on board, sometimes don't, depending on the availability of their paramedic in town.
And would you consider all of these agencies to be emergency responders or first responders?
Yes.
And how long have you been an EMT?
Getting close to 25 years now. I think it was 2000, 2001, around in there is when I took my classes and completed them. I believe I started them in fall of 2000 and completed in 2001.
And you mentioned that you had to take a class.
Yes.
What are the components of that class?
The class, I don't remember the exact hour amount, but there's so many hours of class time instruction. It lasted 5 or 6 months when I took the class. It began in late September, early October, and ran through March. We met 2 to 3 nights a week for 3 to 4 hours a night. Sorry. Yeah. So we 2 to 3 nights a week. And then, so that was the classroom portion. And then as we were taking the classes, you had to pass the different units within the class. Once you passed the class, then you had to also do ride time and clinical time, so many hours working at a hospital ER, making patient contacts and practicing your skills there. And then also so many hours ride time, which would be with an ambulance service, again, making patient contacts and practicing in ambulance situations. Then once that was all done, then you were finally qualified to take the state test where you had to pass skills tests, and then if those were passed, then you went on to take the written test, and then if that's what was passed, you got your license.
Perfect. And then you could start.
And then you can start, yep.
And do you also like recertify or have continuing education?
Yes, we have to do the certifications just changed recently. Now the current level is it's 20 hours of recertification every 2 years for an EMT, but there are certain categories that have to be met. You have to do certain hours of cardiac, airway, trauma, etc. It used to be it was just a blanket 24 hours of recertification, any topic. Now they have different topic categories that you have to hit in order to recertify.
Great. And for the paramedic services like Manchester, are they also volunteer or are they employed or full-time employees?
Most of the services in Delaware County are volunteer, except Manchester is a paid service. They are run out of the hospital, and that is their job is to be on call in the ER and run with the ambulance.
And so as a volunteer, if you're not on a schedule or you're not being paid for certain hours, how are you notified when your assistance is needed?
We all carry pagers or radios. Greeley actually carries like radios similar to a walkie-talkie, that if it's set on page, you only get notified when your department is paged, or you can possibly open it up if you want to and listen to everything that's going on in the county, and then you would hear when other towns are getting paged as well. But then when that goes off, then we know that we have a call and we respond to the station.
And you also live here in Delaware County?
I do live in Delaware County.
And did you grow up here?
I did grow up in Delaware County as well.
And so are you familiar then with the geographic area and the roads and where different landmarks are?
Yes.
I want to ask you specifically about a call that, and about November 10th, 2018.
Okay.
Judge, can we approach for a quick moment?
I've just been informed that there are individuals observing the trial who are taking photographs with their phones. That is not permissible. Any phone in the courtroom is to be turned off and put away. If photography, videoing, or anything is observed by any non-approved individual, there are obviously members of the media who have been approved, but any other individual who is taking photos or recordings of any sort, if that is observed or it continues, you'll be asked to leave the courtroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yep, you may continue, Ms. Nichols-Cook. Ms. Pierschbacher, you're very fast.
Slow down.
And I
apologize.
don't blame you. Nobody wants to be the first witness.
Yeah.
So if you can slow down just a little bit.
I will try.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Ms. Pierschbacher, I believe we were getting ready to start talking about November 10th, 2018.
Yes.
Do you remember that day and what you were doing?
Yes. That morning, my husband and I had gone to Cedar Falls to pick up our 3 kids. They had a sleepover with their grandparents the night before. And then as we were coming back from Cedar Falls and traveling north on Highway 38, just about home, my husband did have his pager open, as I had said, you could, just listening to traffic, and we heard a call from Manchester ambulance to the Earlville area for what appeared to be a farming accident at that time.
And so when you say he had his pager open, are you saying that it was open to the entire Delaware County
Yes,
traffic?
we could hear all Everything coming across, it's called county fire. It's the channel that all the fire and EMS are paged on. We didn't necessarily hear what all law enforcement was saying or what anyone else in the county. It was the fire and the EMS paging channel is what he had open.
And you were with your husband, Dave.
Yes, Dave, my husband.
Same last name?
Same last name, yes. David Pierschbacher was his name.
Can you tell me a little bit about Dave and why he had a pager?
He was the fire chief in Greeley. He ran basically the fire side of our service, and at the time I was the EMS officer, which put me in charge of the EMS side of our service, but it was basically one combined service. So yes, we were both members of Greeley Fire and Ambulance. We both carry pagers. His happened to be open to the Delaware County channel at that point in time. Mine was closed to just page.
And do EMTs normally work together in twos or in pairs?
Our protocols is that you always go with at least two. You never leave the station without two. And since we are an EMT service, one of those two must be an EMT. We do have members of our service who are fire only. We have some people who are EMRs, which means emergency medical responders, which would be the next level below an EMT. There's a couple of skills that EMTs do that EMRs cannot. And we have a few of those. But our protocols are if the ambulance goes, there's a minimum of two people on board, and one of those two must be an EMT.
And was Dave an EMT?
He was as well, yes.
And it's my understanding he's unable to be here today.
No, he is not here today.
And why is that?
He passed away in 2022.
Okay. So while you were driving back from Cedar Falls, I think you started to say you were listening to traffic and you heard a call. Can you tell us about that call?
We heard it sounded like Manchester Ambulance getting paged for what at that time appeared to be a farming accident. It said that there was a male subject who was transporting a female subject to the hospital along 170th Street, that she had been hit by forks, and that that Manchester was paged out to intercept with them. But also at some point it was said that the original location was somewhere near Earlville, because I remember Dave asked me, why is Manchester responding to Earlville? And I said, I don't know.
Was that unusual?
Not kind of. Usually Earlville would have taken that area, but we didn't know, were they out on another call or something else? There are circumstances where different ambulances cover different territories.
And is Earlville also a volunteer?
They're also volunteer.
EMS? Okay. And did you have any impression or recollection of what the demeanor was while you were listening to this radio traffic from dispatch?
I just remember everything just seemed very confusing. We were just listening to the traffic, and we heard Manchester Ambulance go en route, and we heard them continue to ask dispatch for a location, and that they said that they were coming in on 170th Street, and then at some point we heard them say that the subject had stopped so that they could start CPR on the female victim, that they were somewhere along the road on 170th Street. So Manchester Ambulance headed in that direction. And so we were still continuing north on Highway 38 from Delaware to Greeley. And at some point, Manchester Ambulance was continuing to ask for more directions, or how far out are they, and they really weren't getting any information. And then Manchester Ambulance asked dispatch to page first responders, and that's when Dave and I said, oh, that's us, we need to get to the station, because we even flipped on our blue light, our light that we use to respond to situations, and we started heading right for the station, thinking that it was us getting paged and we had to get there. And then dispatch actually paged Manchester first responders. So we're like, oh, but we were already at the station at that point, so we just waited for a minute to see what would happen.
And for those of us that didn't grow up in Delaware County, how close is Manchester and Greeley, or along 170th Street?
Along 170th Street. 170th Street, it's also known as the Oneida Blacktop. It is a long road, I don't know, probably 12 miles, I'd say, between Greeley and Manchester-ish. I know it's 17 to my house, but I live a little bit further than Greeley, so.
At some point, while you and Dave were at the Greeley station, did you prepare to respond or leave the station?
At some point when we continued to hear the voice traffic back and forth of where are they located, how far out, Dave did get on the radio and ask Manchester Ambulance if he would like Greeley to respond from that side of 170th to see if we could find them, and figuring between Manchester and us coming from the two directions, eventually we would run into them at some point. And Manchester Ambulance responded yes. So Dave and I got in the ambulance and took off, and we radioed to Manchester that we were en route. We radioed to Manchester Dispatch that we were en route.
Okay. And so is it a fair characterization that the people needing help were somewhere on 170th Street, the Manchester Ambulance left from the hospital in Manchester, and then you left from Greeley?
Went from Greeley.
And you guys, did you eventually meet?
At some point, we were going to meet up. We actually found the victim first. They ended up being very close to Greeley, actually. They had not gotten as far, as close to Manchester as we had thought they had maybe gotten. We actually found them just south of Greeley, 2.5 miles, at kind of the intersection of 38 and 170th.
Great. What did you see when you got to that intersection?
When we got to the intersection, the first thing we noticed is the flashing lights from the deputies' cars. At that point, the deputies had arrived. We had just passed that location a few minutes before, but didn't notice anything. Now we saw the flashing lights, and so we're like, that's where it is, and we radioed to Manchester where we were. We went to turn into the driveway, and one deputy ran to the road to meet us to make sure that we saw them and that we knew that's where we were going. So we pulled into the driveway. It was the driveway of a home that was under construction at the time. So there was nobody who lived there, and the driveway was very rocky and muddy. It was under construction. And so when we pulled in, we could see a deputy was performing chest compressions on the female victim, and there was a forklift nearby for the construction of the home. And so after being paged that we had heard somebody hit by forks, I was still thinking bale spears from a tractor, and then I started to think, oh, that forklift was somehow involved in this incident. And so Dave and I pulled the ambulance over as we pulled into the driveway to the left to get out of the way for the other approaching ambulances. I went directly to the victim to relieve the deputy who was giving compressions, and Dave got the equipment out of the ambulance, the Lucas device and the AED.
Okay.
And then he met me at the victim a few seconds later.
And if I missed this, did you know who was building that house or whose property you were on?
I did know whose property we were on. It's the property of Brian and Rachel Krogman.
Okay. And you mentioned that from the radio traffic and from the dispatch statements that you thought you were going to a tractor baling fork accident.
That's what I thought.
For those of us that aren't farmers, a baling fork, a larger item?
It's a large attachment that goes on the front of a tractor to move large round bales.
Okay. And did you have any concerns about a patient being transported by their family towards the hospital?
No.
And why is that?
Because it's common in our area. We're very rural. We all know what the transport times are and what the response times are. I know just for our own department, our goal is from the time of the page to be at the patient within 10 minutes. And I think the community knows that too. So, and I know a lot of people kind of think, well, I can be at the hospital in 10 minutes. And so, no, it is not unusual for a family member to just take a loved one on their own, thinking that they could probably get there faster than waiting.
And in your 25 years of being an EMT, have you responded to other farming type of accidents?
Yes. It's not uncommon in the area. It happens. It's a farming community.
Okay. Circling back to what you saw when you were in the driveway, can you describe the patient and what you did next?
As I approached the patient was lying on her back. One of the deputies was doing chest compressions. I observed she was wearing, it appeared to be heavy chore-type clothes, like a thick Carhartt coat. Underneath was a thick hooded sweatshirt. I believe I said she was lying on her back on the gravel driveway. Her head was turned slightly to the right, and her face, the right side, was covered with blood and a brown substance that appeared to be vomit. And the vomit was coming from her nose and her mouth. It was on the right side of her face, and it was also caked in her hair.
Okay. And what was the first thing you did when you reached the patient?
I took over compressions for the deputy.
Why did you do that first?
Because 2 minutes is about the limit that anyone can do good chest compressions. It's just standard that you try to relieve a compressor within 2 minutes if possible, just because after that fatigue starts to set in and then the compressions aren't always as effective. I had no idea how long he had been doing compressions. I was guessing probably longer than 2 minutes at that point. So I was trying to relieve him and get a fresh person on her until we could get the other equipment in place.
And when you started chest compressions, were you doing them over the sweatshirt or over the coat?
The coat was open, but I continued to do compressions over the sweatshirt.
Okay. And did you observe any other obvious injuries or wounds?
No, not at that time.
And were you expecting to see something else?
Well, I was picturing getting hit by bale forks. I was expecting to see very large wounds somewhere and that I was not seeing. And so I was confused as to how the bale forks came into this picture, because I wasn't seeing the massive trauma that I was expecting to see that I would expect bale forks to cause.
And did you know who the deputies were at the scene?
One was Deputy Thompson and one was Deputy Hollub.
Okay. Did you guys have a conversation or exchange information about what had happened?
We just started talking. I do know at one point when I started compressions and I asked what happened, one of the deputies told me, I think we were dealing with a fall. And then I'm pretty sure at one point I asked, did this happen here? Because I was still under the impression that that forklift I saw sitting off to the side had somehow been involved in this incident. And then that's when Todd, who was in the background, he said, no, this didn't happen here. This happened at our farm a few miles east of here.
Did you know the identity of your patient at the time?
At that point, no, I did not.
Did anybody else from the Greeley EMT team respond?
Eventually, there was a third Greeley person who got to the scene of the patient, Steve Engelken. As I took over compressions, I did ask the deputy to page Greeley for more help, because at that point our pagers had not tripped yet. It was just Dave and I. I knew we had other people close by that we could probably get there faster even than Manchester ambulance could, if they would just be paged. And the deputy asked for Greeley to be paged, and the dispatch replied with, Greeley's already on scene, they don't need to be paged. And so we asked again to have them paged for more help, and then Greeley was paged. By the time most of the responders responded, Manchester had already gotten there. So Steve Engelken is another member of our service who did get to the patient. I believe he got there at roughly the same time that Manchester ambulance arrived.
Okay.
But I know he was helping with resuscitation efforts at some point. The rest of the Greeley people arrived, but already saw Manchester ambulance and Greeley ambulance and everyone there, so they stayed on the road and conducted traffic control and did not approach the scene.
Okay. And then you mentioned that Dave got the Lucas device and the AED off the ambulance. Can you tell us a little bit about what a Lucas device is?
A Lucas device is basically an automatic CPR device. There's a board that resembles, I don't know, maybe a snowboard would be the closest comparison I can think of. Has a slight curve to it. It goes under the patient's back, like from armpit to armpit. And then there's another U-shaped device that comes down and clips over top of that. And then from that device, there's a plunger that goes down onto the patient's chest. And then once it's turned on, the plunger does the compressions for you. So then the manual compressions are no longer an issue, and we don't have to worry about rescue or fatigue. The Lucas just keeps going with good quality compressions.
Okay. And so, and then how is an AED different?
The AED is an automatic external defibrillator. That is the part that actually attaches to the person's chest and shocks the heart to try to get it back into rhythm.
Okay. And what did you do what did you guys do first?
Once Dave got to us with both of those devices, the first thing we did is attach the AED. At that point, we pulled the victim's sweatshirt up and we attached the two pads. The pads go upper right, lower, and then on the right side, and then on the rib, lower rib on the left side. So we attached the pads, we turned it on, it analyzed, and then an AED is looking for a certain cardiac rhythm before it will issue a shock. So as it analyzed, we stopped our compressions and let it analyze, which is protocol. And then the first time it analyzed, it said no shock advised, which meant it did not pick up that shockable rhythm, continue CPR, so we continued CPR.
Okay. And when you pushed your patient's clothing up, did you make any observations about other injuries?
Yeah, we looked, as we lifted up her shirt, we were looking for some other things to see because I was still trying to figure out how this injury happened. There was what appeared to be possibly a slight bruise on the right rib cage. At that point, it was very faint. We thought maybe it was a bruise, but we weren't 100% sure. And then there was also a mark above her right breast that looked possibly like a very small puncture wound, but again, we weren't 100% sure what we were looking at. We saw something there, but had not, were not able to determine what had caused that. So we made note of it in our report.
Did you observe anything, any injuries on her face area?
Again, possibly a slight bruise on the right side that was noted in the report. Again, at the time that we saw her, it appeared very faint. We thought it was possibly a bruise, but we were not 100% sure. So again, we noted it in the report.
Okay. After you set up the AED, did you then do the Lucas device?
Yes, once we did the first analyzing with the AED and said no shock advised, continue CPR. I continued manual chest compressions, and then Dave and the deputy started setting up the Lucas device. Dave started and the deputy assisted with getting everything in place. I continued manual compressions until the Lucas was in place and could start.
Okay. And you were able to utilize the Lucas to do chest compressions?
Yes, and then once it was in place, we turned it on and the Lucas took over chest compressions.
What did you do after that?
Then I went back to the ambulance to get the airway bag to secure an airway and to start breathing for the patient. So I brought the airway bag back to the patient, opened it up. I took out a King LT, that was the intubation device preferred at the time. And so that's what I took out. At the time that I had gotten that out, then that's when Manchester arrived on scene.
Okay.
I apologize for the interruption, but could we have a quick sidebar?
Sure.
I'm going to step out for just a second. Go ahead and continue the talk.
Again, folks, I want to be crystal clear that unless you are an approved member of the media, there is to be no photography, recording, social media posting, or any recording of any kind of this proceeding. I am aware that there is a specific individual in this courtroom who has posted photos on a social media site from this trial this morning. It is only because I cannot ascertain specifically if that photo or those photos were posted before or after my preliminary warning that that individual is not already being removed from the courtroom by a deputy. If there are any further posts, the individual will be removed, as will any others. We will not have this proceeding derailed by members of the public who are not following the restrictions on recording, photography, and the rules of this court. My apologies to the witness and to counsel. I hope we have no further interruptions. Ms. Pierschbacher, again, if you can try to slow down. I think you just get faster and faster. Okay. All right. Ms. Nichols-Cook, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Pierschbacher, maybe act like we're high schoolers, I guess, and we don't listen the first time and just go slow for us. But we were talking about an airway bag, and could you help us all understand a little bit about what you were using? I think we've all seen mouth to mouth, and so tell me about the airway bag.
Okay, so our airway bag specifically carries all of the equipment that we would need if a patient were to have a breathing problem. There is an oxygen tank in that airway bag. There is also it's called an AMVU bag. It's the bag that you put over their mouth and squeeze to help ventilate them. That we carry in there. There is also nasopharyngeal airways, which go into the patient's nose, and oral airways, which are hard airways that go into the patient's mouth that are used to hold the tongue out of the way. Those airways are used for a patient who is still semi-conscious and would have a gag reflex, who would not tolerate anything down their throat. In this particular case, we used a King LT, which is a long tube that is inserted into the patient's mouth, and it goes into their trachea, and there are two balloons that blow up to hold it into place, and then there's a small opening at the top that AMVU bag I was talking about. If you take the mouthpiece off, the round tip goes right onto the top of the King airway, and then we can ventilate directly into the patient's lungs. So that is what I was getting, the airway bag, and that's what we had decided was our best option for that patient at that time.
Okay. And was your patient responsive at all?
No.
And in order to insert the tube then into your patient, did you have to do anything with her mouth or her nose?
Yes. So when I inserted the tube, what I did is I positioned myself at her head so that she was directly in front of me. I was at the top of her head. Other people were still working on doing things with her. I was kneeling on the ground above her head, and then what I do to insert is I reach through and I grab her lower jaw and her tongue, and I lift it up to pull the tongue out of the way and to open her mouth. And then with my other hand, I take the tube and insert it into her airway, and then we have a syringe that then blows up those balloons to hold that tube into place.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned that the right side of your patient's face had blood or maybe a vomit substance.
Yes.
Was that still present when you were inserting the tube?
It was still present, and before the tube was inserted, we used a suction device to suction her mouth clean and clear so that we could get the tube in without getting any extra debris into her airway.
Okay. Would getting debris in her airway be harmful to your efforts to get her breathing?
Well, it could, because then it would be basically like aspirating whatever that was, and then it would just cause further problems for the patient down the road.
Okay. And I think you mentioned that as you were working to do this, the Manchester paramedics arrived.
Yes, the Manchester crew arrived because at first when they arrived, we filled them in on the situation and told them what we had done so far and what we knew. And then I actually backed off on the airway for a moment, just because at that time it was their scene to control. And I just said, we're about to insert an airway. And then that's when they said, well, you are an EMT, you can do that skill, right? And I said, yes, I can. And then they said, please do help us. And so we stayed on scene and continued to help them as they were doing what they were doing.
And in addition to suctioning out the mouth and the nose, did you also have to move her face or handle, wipe things off of her?
I don't remember if we did any wiping. I do know we did have to suction, and then her head was turned slightly to the right, so we would have pulled her head back to center to make it easier to insert that tube.
Okay. After you inserted the airway tube, what do you remember doing next?
At that point, then we hooked up the airway bag, and I started to ventilate for her. The ventilations were going in harder than I expected them to. I was feeling some resistance, which is not normal. But at that time, that's when we were getting ready to move the patient. They had brought a sheet from one of the ambulances. And so the way that we lifted her that day is we did something called a log roll, where we roll the patient onto her side, put the sheet under her, pull it back out from the other side, and now she's laying on a sheet instead of on the bare ground. And then we're able to use that sheet to lift her and get her onto the cot and into the ambulance. So the sheet was the method that we used that day to get her up onto the cot and loaded. So at the time I got the airway in place was the time that we rolled her, got her onto the sheet, and moved her towards the ambulance. I was ventilating the whole way to the ambulance. When we got to the ambulance, I did tell the paramedic, please check this airway. There's more resistance than there should be. Make sure I got it right. And then I handed the airway bag off to one of the Manchester personnel, and they continued care to Manchester.
Did you note any other injuries during that log roll procedure?
During the log roll procedure, I did not see any other injuries myself. As the patient was rolled, I moved with her face to continue to give ventilations. I did hear one of the Manchester responders say, we have a through and through, when they saw her back. I personally never saw her back at the scene. I don't know what it looked like, but I did hear one of the Manchester responders make that comment.
Did you note any other injuries to her mouth, a cut, or anything like that?
No.
And in your experience, is the act of performing CPR or using a Lucas device a traumatic event to the body?
It can be, yes.
Was your care ending then as the patient was loaded into Manchester's ambulance?
Yes, that is where our care of the patient ended. We handed off to Manchester. Shortly after Manchester ambulance arrived on scene, so did Manchester first responders, because they were paged out after. So between those two crews, they got enough people in the back of the ambulance to continue care all the way to Manchester. So it was Manchester's full ambulance crew. And then I believe a couple of their first responders who came out in the first responder rig also went back with them to be extra hands to help with resuscitation. So we were not needed to go in the ambulance with them. They had enough people.
Okay. And at some point, do you learn the patient's name?
Yes, as we were loading her into the ambulance, one of the Manchester responders or ambulance members said, we need a name and a birth date for the victim. And then that's when we asked, what is her name and birth date? And that's when we learned it was Amy Mullis. Up until that point, I didn't realize who we were working on.
Had you met Amy Mullis before November 10th, 2018?
Yeah, we were acquaintances. Amy's and Todd's daughter was in gymnastics with my daughter, so we would see each other at gymnastics events, and they also attended the same church as us.
Did you realize the individual providing information to you during your care was Todd Mullis?
I did not realize that either at the time. It was out of context. I was used to seeing him together with the family, and this was out of context. So no, I did not place that. That was Todd as well.
Can you describe Todd's demeanor while you were on the scene?
From what I observed, he seemed to be kind of anxious, nervous. He seemed to be pacing in the background. He wasn't interfering with resuscitation efforts at all, but he was close by to provide information as we would need it. As if we would start to talk about something or ask something, he would respond right away with information he had or knew. But yeah, he was close by enough to give information, was pacing.
Nothing that alarmed you?
No.
Did, I'm sorry, I'll start over. Did you also then know Todd and Amy's children?
I did. At that point in time, I knew the younger two children better. Wyatt and Taylor went to church with us. I was their Sunday school teacher for a while. I knew Tristan also at that point from seeing him in church with the family, but I did not know him as well as I knew the younger two.
Did you see Tristan on November 10th, 2018?
Yes, a little bit later. Up until that point, I had not noticed him. After Amy was loaded into the ambulance and Manchester took off for the hospital, we turned to start getting our stuff picked up, and that's when I realized Tristan was there as well. He was standing back a lot further than Todd. There was a trailer attached to the pickup that they had been using to try to get Amy to the hospital, and he was on the back side of the trailer.
After the Manchester ambulance left, what did you and the other Greeley EMTs do?
Because some of the Manchester first responders had left in the ambulance service, or in the Manchester ambulance, that left a couple of their first responder vehicles unmanned. So our other responder, Steve, who was on scene, he actually helped Manchester to get the rest of their vehicles back to their station. Dave and I took the ambulance and we followed to Manchester because our Lucas device was still being used in resuscitation efforts. And so we said we would just follow and wait for it to be done to get it back. So we proceeded to Manchester. We stopped at the fire station we stopped at Manchester Fire Station to pick our other responder, Steve, up because that's where they keep their first responder vehicles after he helped them drop those off. And then the three of us proceeded to the hospital to wait for the Lucas.
Okay. When you got to the hospital, where did you go?
We just went into the common area in the ER, the hallways. We were just planning to hang out in a corner and try to stay out of the way until things were done.
And did you observe Todd Mullis or any of the other family there as well?
Todd, I believe, was there and had a friend with him, and they were in kind of the family waiting room. They had a special waiting room, not the general public waiting room that everyone goes into. There's a separate one back in the ER for family to wait in, and so he was in there with a friend.
Okay. Did medical staff approach you and Dave or Steve?
One of the RNs came up to us as soon as we got there, and
calls for hearsay on.
Sustained.
What did you and Dave do after you interacted with medical staff?
we waited. Dave we would take turns waiting in the family room with Todd. Dave spent most of the time in there. I went in, I believe, once for a couple of minutes.
Right here. And were you asked to go in? Were you instructed or informed that you needed to go into the waiting room?
Objection calls for hearsay or relies on hearsay testimony.
Your Honor, it's been offered to show what she did and why she did it.
Overruled. The witness can answer.
We were told to make sure Todd was not left alone and to make sure one of us was with him at all times.
Hearsay again asks that the objection precede the response, Your Honor.
Overruled. The answer will remain in the record.
In your 20 plus years of experience as an EMT, has that ever happened to you before?
No.
Did you make any observations of Todd's demeanor while you were in the waiting room or at the hospital?
It was similar to on scene. He appeared anxious to me, was pacing.
At some point, were you able to not stay in the family waiting room any longer?
Another RN came in.
Are you familiar with former Sheriff LeClaire?
I am.
Did you see him at the hospital on November 10th?
I did.
Did you speak with him or see him speak to anybody?
I did not.
Objection calls for hearsay response again, Your Honor.
I didn't ask what was said, Your Honor.
I did not speak to him myself. I did observe he and Dave speaking to each other.
And since Dave was a fire chief in the county, was that unusual or alarming?
No.
At some point, were you able to retrieve your equipment and depart Manchester Hospital?
Yes, at some point when the Lucas device was finished being used, we got it back, and then we left and returned to Greeley's fire station.
Okay. Did you respond to any other EMS calls that day?
We did have another EMS call later that night.
Did that take you back to the Regional Medical Center in Manchester?
Yes, we transported that patient there as well.
Did you ever learn that there was concerns or instructions to complete your report in a certain way?
When we returned back for that second EMS call that night, we were actually with Edgewood crew at that time. Edgewood was the transporting service. They needed extra help, so Dave and I both ended up being in the back with the patient on the way in. When we got to the hospital, I stayed in the rig and started cleaning everything up. Dave and the rest of the Edgewood crew members actually delivered the patient into the ER. When Dave returned to the ambulance after dropping the patient off, he told me that...
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay within hearsay.
Sustained.
Let me try to rephrase a little bit there. Did you complete a report about the service call regarding Amy Mullis?
I did.
And did your husband, Dave Pierschbacher, contribute to that report?
He did.
Did your colleague, Steve Ingleton, also contribute?
He did.
Okay. And did you have an understanding that you need to take some extra care or caution when writing your report?
Yeah, most reports are completed thoroughly, though I usually I always make a point that every report is completed thoroughly.
And at some point, did you learn that Amy's death was being investigated as a murder?
I did.
And do you recall when you learned that?
That evening at the ER.
I've got a copy of your report here marked as Exhibit 216. If we can show that to you to make sure we have the right report. We'll try to get it on the screen there for you. Ms. Pierschbacher, have you had an opportunity to look at Exhibit 216?
Yes.
Okay. And does this appear to be the report that you wrote and submitted regarding?
It appears to be.
And can you tell the date that you submitted this report?
I'm not sure it's on this front page, but if I remember correctly, it was November 13th.
And so that would have been just a couple of days after
Yes.
you responded to the call? And I think you just said you submitted it. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means? Like, how do you submit it? Where does it go?
The system that we use for EMS reporting is called Image Trend. We all go in and it's what every EMS service uses. We complete the report and then it stays open, and when we are satisfied that it is done, we hit lock and submit, and it is locked and submitted, and then it uploads to the state database, and at that point then it is considered submitted.
Okay. And after you submitted your report here in Exhibit 216, did law enforcement ever talk to you about your observations from November 10th or your report?
No,
Did anybody from the Delaware County Attorney's Office talk to you about it?
no,
And I apologize, I said law enforcement earlier, specifically Delaware County Sheriff. Did anyone talk to you? The Iowa DCI?
no,
And have you ever spoken to anybody from the Iowa Attorney General's office about the substance of your report?
no,
And were you aware, or are you aware now, that Todd Mullis was charged with Amy's murder and tried and convicted of that?
yes, I am aware of that.
And then we'll flip to Exhibit 215 and have you identify that for us.
Yeah, this is an affidavit.
So 215 is an affidavit that you signed regarding November 10th.
Yes,
And my copy is a little faint, so maybe yours is a little better, but is it dated in 2023?
I believe so. I don't see the signature page on my screen, but I believe that's when it was.
We'll scroll for you.
Yes, 2023.
And prior to this affidavit in 2023, did you speak with any attorney representing Mr. Mullis?
No,
Any private investigators or anybody talk to you?
no,
Was there anything about Todd's behavior or demeanor on November 10th that was alarming to you or caused you concern?
no.
Your Honor, if I could have one moment, and then I think we already have an agreement to admit 215 and 216, but I would formally move to admit those exhibits. Got one or two more. I apologize. Thank you for your patience. Ms. Pierschbacher, while you were on the scene that day providing care and waiting at the hospital, did you ever observe any or hear anything that caused you to think that Ms. Mullis's injuries were not an accident?
No,
Okay. And I know you said earlier that it's not uncommon for there to be farming accidents. And so can you expand a little bit on that, like what types of accidents you have responded to over the years?
Your Honor, I am going to object on the grounds of beyond the scope of the lay witness's testimony. She's not a certified expert, and it's her testimony as to other incidents are irrelevant for her insight and for purposes of this proceeding.
Sustained.
Let me re-ask that. Have you responded personally as an EMT to other farming accidents?
yes,
And have those included things like falls
yes,
and onto whether it's a farm implement or a fork or some other tool?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, this is irrelevant. It's both beyond the scope, not an expert, and simultaneously leading.
Your Honor, I'm asking for her personal experience. I'm not asking for an expert opinion.
yes. We have been called to emergencies that involved farm implement, and we have been called to emergencies where people have fallen. We've been called to emergencies where people have been trapped. Yeah, there's several different types of farming emergencies that happen.
One last question is, do you have any recollection of the weather on November 10th? It's winter in Iowa, but other than that, do you have anything?
It was very cold. I remember it was very cold, very bitter. I believe there was like a skiff of snow on the ground at the time.
Okay. Nothing further from me, Your Honor.
Counsel, any objection to Exhibits 216 and 215?
Your Honor, no objection to the inclusion of 216, but we would object to the inclusion of Exhibit 215. As it is hearsay, includes hearsay within hearsay as well, and is inadmissible. I believe it also predates the filing of this case and therefore was not made as a part of the record for any sort of consistency.
216 is admitted. Counsel, did you want to respond to the objections 215?
Yes, Your Honor. I think there might be some confusion. I guess it was my impression the state didn't have any objections to 215, but additionally, it's a part of the original post-conviction relief application filing in this matter. Ms. Pierschbacher has identified it, and I can ask her some additional questions as far as, where the information comes from in it. But I do believe it's an admissible document that this court should consider.
Well, to the extent it was identified as an attachment, I guess, to the petition, it's there. The court will consider it in that fashion. Generally, I'm not going to admit affidavits, though, of witnesses who are here to testify. So 215 is not going to be admitted as a separate exhibit. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Pierschbacher.
Good morning.
At the time of Ms. Mullis's death, you had been an EMT or volunteer firefighter for about 20 years. Is that fair to say?
Just shy of that, yes.
And since then, obviously, you are still a volunteer.
Correct.
On the day in question, you were dispatched around 11 minutes after noon, right?
Yes.
And you arrived somewhere around 12:14, 3 minutes later.
Yes.
According to your report, which has now been admitted as Exhibit 216, you reached Ms. Mullis or Amy Mullis for an assessment at 12:15, right?
I believe if that's what it says in the report, then yes.
And the Lucas device that you explained earlier was placed a minute later.
Yes, if that's what it says.
And at that time, you left Ms. Mullis's body, ceased compressions, and went back to the ambulance, right?
I did because compressions were being taken over by the Lucas device.
So you didn't visualize her during that period of time?
I did not.
And you didn't administer the AED shock at 12:17 either, did you?
Whoever was running the AED did at that point. That's the time that it was shocked.
And I believe if we turn to directing your attention to what is page 4 of Exhibit 216, I believe it references that David Pierschbacher was the one who placed that AED shock, right?
That is possible. Yeah, I don't have that page in front of me, but if that's what it says, then that's what happened.
And 1 minute later, Manchester Ambulance took over the care
Yes.
and administered the life-saving efforts for Ms. Mullis, right?
Yes, once they arrived, yes.
So the entirety of your interaction spanned about 3 minutes.
Probably, yes.
And for the portion of those 3 minutes, you weren't actually with Ms. Mullis the whole time, were you?
Not the entire time, no.
And according to your report, as has already been admitted, you didn't see the injuries in question, right?
I did not.
And you didn't observe the full extent of any puncture wounds, right?
I did not.
You don't document any direct references to Todd Mullis in your report, do you?
No,
You never once reference Tristan Mullis in your report, right?
correct.
And you were familiar with them, as you mentioned, right? Because your focus was actually on Amy Mullis and preventing her or administering life-saving care.
Correct.
So what we do know from your report is that you'd agree that she had bruising documented to her face.
Yes,
And you didn't actually note anything about her hands in question, correct?
no,
In fact, based upon your examination, you had no reason to check her hands, fair?
we did not.
So you can't say whether or not she had any injuries to her hands, right?
That is correct.
Nor could you say that she has any injuries to her legs or feet, right?
No, those, that was removed by Manchester ambulance. They cut the rest of her clothing off of her when they took over care, so that's why that is not in my report, because that was under their care.
So directing to your specific interactions with Amy Mullis on this day, you administered manual compressions
I did.
and you placed the King airway device, right?
I did.
Tube. How long or how many tubes have you placed, would you say?
Over the years.
Can we get a little, I'm sorry, objection, a little foundation as to like a time period? Are you talking the entire 20 years or?
Sure. In a general sense, without holding you to any specific number, over your 20 years' time at that point, how many airway devices had you placed? How many tubes?
At that point, well, those were relatively new at the time. I mean, we haven't had those in the entire 20 years that I had been in EMT, but I placed a dozen.
So you were fairly experienced or aware of how to place them.
Yes,
And to be fair, those don't come into contact with a patient's lips or anything like that specifically, right?
no, mostly it's my hand that comes in contact with her face or her lips as I'm moving her face out of the way to put the tube in.
And in this instance, Manchester Ambulance is the one who was doing the suctioning, not you,
Yes,
right?
that is correct.
So you weren't applying any force with an outside suction, right?
No,
And do you recall or have any reason to believe you caused an injury to her lips yourself?
no,
And generally, when you place a King airway tube specifically, do you cause injuries to the patients you place them or administer them to?
I have not heard of that.
And in your instance, that hasn't happened, right?
No, not that I'm aware of.
So you don't have any reason to believe that she would have caused any damage to Amy Mullis's face or mouth or otherwise, right?
No,
And you didn't ride with her to the hospital either, did you?
I did not.
So your care or interactions with Amy Mullis ended at 12:18 or so.
Yes, whatever time she was loaded in the ambulance, that's when my interaction with her stopped.
And so your total interaction with Amy Mullis would have been 3 minutes, right?
Probably, yes.
In your report, you don't call it a farming accident, though, do you?
What did I reference it as? What did I put in my narrative?
I believe when you were dispatched, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that, like you said earlier, you believe that a woman had been hit by forks,
Or-
right?
Yes, that's what it was dispatched as.
You don't mention a forklift, though, do you?
No,
And you don't mention any bale spears, right?
nope,
So overall, you had no reason to believe or any reason to look into the cause of Miss Mullis's injuries, did you?
just to ask what had happened, and again was told we weren't sure. We thought we were maybe dealing with a fall, was the answer that we got on scene.
Is it safe to say that the family members who are noted in your report, that would be Todd Mullis?
Yes, I believe I just referenced family members in general, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it would have been reported as an unknown incident to you, right?
Yes,
So it wasn't referenced as an accident by Mr. Mullis. Fair?
no,
I'm going to object at that point as asked and answered and beyond this witness's testimony.
Overruled. The answer will remain in the record.
That was you? Yes?
sorry, could you please re-ask the question?
So Mr. Mullis had never referred to it as an accident or otherwise to you, right?
No, it was very confusing. We were trying to figure out what had happened, As you said, the 3 minutes that I was with her, we were trying to see if we could resuscitate her. So that was our primary cause. In my mind, I was running over what could have happened, but our primary focus was to get her back, get a heartbeat and breathing.
So your job wasn't to look into what caused the
No.
incident in question?
We asked the questions to help us figure out what we're dealing with. But in this case, it was very confusing. Nobody really knew. So we focused just on what we could see and took care of that.
So we've referenced your report extensively, which has now been admitted as Exhibit 216. Who do you submit that report to?
I believe it goes to the Iowa Department of Health.
So it doesn't go to any specific agency for inclusion, right?
No, it gets uploaded to the state.
And I believe you've previously referenced the National Emergency Medical Services Information System? Mm-hmm. Fair?
Yes.
Is that also called NMSIS?
Yes.
And for NMSIS, do you know who that goes to?
I do not.
So is it safe to say that you've never in your 25 years checked into where that goes, right?
No. I do know that when our service gets inspected every 3 years by the state, the Iowa Department of Public Health comes out and they do have access to all of those reports, and they have all of our information on when reports were filed and in what a timely manner, and that is checked into them. So I do know that at that point, the Iowa Department of Public Health Emergency Services Agency, who keeps track of the EMS services, they have those reports.
And so those reports don't actually go to anyone other than the state agency designated to receive them, right?
As far as I know.
And in that case, the NMSIS program is actually administered at the federal level, fair?
I believe so.
So that data is not being aggregated by, say, the hospital in Delaware County.
I don't know.
You have never provided the report specifically to a hospital in Delaware County, right?
Not that final report, no.
Did you provide any other version of a report to a healthcare provider in this case?
Yes.
And so that would be documented in the medical records or referenced otherwise?
It should be in Manchester's report that they received ours. What we usually do is when we get on scene, we don't pull out our computers and do the final report there. We have handwritten notes and we pull off the top sheet and it goes with the patient. So in this case, when we handed off the patient to Manchester, our top sheet of notes went with her, with Manchester, to become part of their report.
And that's because it was Manchester who was in charge of her transport to the hospital.
Because they transported her, yes.
And in charge of handing over care to the hospital emergency room.
Correct.
So that wasn't you in this
We
case.
did not hand her over to the emergency room. No, we did not. We handed her over to Manchester Ambulance Service.
But on scene, you talked to Todd Mullis, correct?
Yes. Well, in passing, he was in the background giving answers. I did not specifically talk to him one-on-one.
You also confirmed some of the details with the deputies, yes?
Yes.
And so in question, you were also known to the Mullis family, weren't you?
I believe so. Somewhat more so Amy and the younger two kids at that point in time.
Because you went to the same church and your families interacted,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So at that point, Todd Mullis and you were already familiar.
In passing, as an acquaintance.
Ultimately, it's safe to say you can't actually explain the full extent of Amy Mullis's injuries that she sustained that day, right?
No, I cannot.
And you can't describe the extent of the location of where her injuries were seen.
No.
And your report would only document the injuries that would already be noted in her medical records or by other care staff, right?
Objection, beyond the scope of this witness's knowledge. There's been no foundation laid that she's ever seen medical records from a hospital related to Ms. Mullis.
Kelly, can you read me the question? I'm sorry.
Your report would only document the injuries that would already be noted in their medical records or by other care staff, right?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm
Would you mind
happy to
asking
rephrase,
one?
Your Honor.
Right, thank you.
You mentioned earlier that the extent of the injuries would have gone to Manchester Ambulance, right?
Correct.
And that Manchester Ambulance would have provided that information also to the hospital, correct?
Yes, they should have. Yes, I assume they did.
And that's because they ultimately transferred care to the emergency room, right?
Correct.
So the bruising on Amy Mullis's face or the puncture wounds to her body or any other documented injuries would primarily be noted by her medical records or by that staff. Is that fair?
Possibly.
Because you would have provided or noted the same injuries that were noted by Manchester Ambulance, right?
No,
Yeah.
objection, Your Honor. I think the question is asking this witness to say what Manchester paramedics did or what's in the Manchester reports, which she has not seen, or nor did she write. So this is an improper question and asks for speculation.
Sustained.
After you responded for those three and provided those 3 minutes or so of care, did you have any other interaction with Amy Mullis?
No.
You did not provide the report to any law enforcement, correct?
No.
And you normally would not provide those reports to law enforcement,
Not
right?
unless asked.
I don't have anything further, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Very briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Pierschbacher, law enforcement knew you were on the scene.
Correct.
You have been a member of the Delaware County community your entire life.
Correct.
Law enforcement spoke with you while you were providing care.
Yes.
Is it a normal protocol and or is it required by the Department of Public Health that you complete and submit a report?
Yes.
Do you have any obligation to send that report out to the law enforcement you interacted with?
No.
And you mentioned that you would have taken the top sheet of your notes and sent them with the patient. When you describe that, are you describing like a carbon copy where you also kept a copy of
Yes.
those notes? And we talked a little bit earlier about you submitted this report, but it included observations and actions of the other two EMTs from Greeley.
Yes.
Okay. And is that normal protocol for an EMS EMT report?
Yes.
And you were asked about your entire interaction with Ms. Mullis only being about 3 minutes. Is that unusual?
No.
You were asked a little bit about the dispatch and the farming records, and I believe you testified, so I just want to clarify that you heard over your pager, over the radio, and dispatch was calling it a tractor, baling, fork type of accident.
Yes.
Okay. And you and Dave responded from Greeley in part because Manchester was not responding fast enough or could not find the patient. Is that your understanding?
Yes, there was confusion on where exactly the patient was located and how long it would take Manchester to reach them.
Ms. Pierschbacher, you heard us talk a little bit about your affidavit. Is there anything in your affidavit that you feel is not accurate or reflective of your experience on November 10th?
No.
Objection and relevance, Your Honor. This affidavit's already been excluded.
I would go 822 last affidavits.
The objection's overruled. The answer will remain in the record.
Did you ever talk to anybody from the state medical examiner's office about Amy Mullis's death?
No.
Okay. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any recross?
None needed, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take a morning recess for about 15 minutes. I'll see you back then.